At exactly 11:08 in the morning, August 15, 2012, 30,000 corporate monitors went dark across Saudi Aramco simultaneously. Within hours, every workstation in the most valuable company on earth was unbootable. Every server was silent. Every hard drive had been overwritten with garbage. At the most fundamental sector, Sector 0, the master boot record, Aramco supplies roughly a tenth of the world's oil. The world's most valuable company was instantly rendered into 30,000 expensive paperweights. Inside 2 hours, executives were managing the global oil supply on 1970s typewriters and fax machines. This is File 15, the silicon wipe. The Shamoon attack was perfectly timed. August 14, 2012 fell in the final days of Ramadan, a few days before the Eid al-Fitr holiday. Saudi Aramco's IT Operations Center was running on a thinned overnight crew during the last 10 days of Ramadan. The corporate IT Operations Center, which on a normal weekday would have 100 analysts watching network telemetry, was running on a skeleton crew of 2. The geopolitical context behind the timing was equally precise. The previous summer, 2010, the Stuxnet worm, jointly developed by the United States and Israel, had been discovered inside Iranian centrifuge controllers at Natanz. Tehran had publicly committed to retaliation against Western and Gulf-allied energy infrastructure. Saudi Aramco, as the largest single source of crude oil flowing to Western refineries, sat at the top of every analyst's target list. Cybersecurity forensics teams, who later analyzed the Shamoon binary, noted that its file system overwrite routine reused obscure subroutines, code patterns, and operational tradecraft consistent with previously catalogued Iranian-attributed tooling. The fingerprint was not conclusive, it was directional. Symantec's W32 disk track analysis noted that the initial infection vector was not publicly identified in the technical forensics. Subsequent reporting indicated an insider with deep physical access to the Dhahran campus. That the initial infection required physical access to the Aramco corporate network. An insider, or someone with deep physical access to the Dhahran campus, plugged a small USB drive into a workstation with high-level network privileges and waited 90 seconds. The malicious payload, less than a megabyte in size, copied itself onto the workstation. The USB drive came back out. The insider walked away. Cybersecurity researchers later attributed the operation to a previously unknown state-sponsored adversary group that claimed the attack under the persona-cutting sword of justice in a self-published manifesto. The specific designation APT33 would not be coined until 5 years afterward, in 2017. The group's communication infrastructure showed operational hours synchronized to Tehran time. The wiper code carried Persian calendar comments embedded in its compiled binary. The attribution was, by intelligence analytic standards, high confidence. Over the following 3 hours, Shamoon spread laterally across the Aramco intranet. It used standard Windows administrative protocols. It stole domain controller credentials. It enumerated network shares. It quietly compromised approximately 30,000 endpoints. The lateral propagation was buried beneath the normal background traffic of a global enterprise network. The night shift monitoring console saw nothing unusual. The propagation technique was textbook but ruthlessly efficient. Shamoon's first action on each newly infected endpoint was to harvest cached domain administrator credentials from memory. Those credentials then granted access to additional endpoints across the Active Directory tree. Each newly compromised endpoint repeated the cycle. The geometric expansion through a flat enterprise network with privileged service accounts was, by the second hour, advancing at thousands of endpoints per minute. Shamoon was not designed for espionage. It was not designed to steal data. It was not designed to extract money. It had a single hard-coded job. At exactly 11:08 in the morning, Saudi Arabia local time, on August 15th, Every infected endpoint would simultaneously execute the wiper payload. At 11:07 a.m., the trigger condition was about to be met, and nobody at Aramco had any idea. At 11:08 in the morning local time, Shamoon detonated. The master boot record is the most fundamental sector on a hard drive. 512 bytes located at Sector 0. It contains the partition table that tells the computer where the operating system is stored, the bootloader that hands off control once power on completes, and the disk signature that identifies the drive uniquely. Without an intact master boot record, the computer is incapable of starting up. The drive becomes, from the operating system's perspective, an unformatted slab of magnetic media. On 30,000 endpoints simultaneously, Shamoon overwrote the master boot record with garbage. The specific garbage was an embedded JPEG fragment. The specific garbage was a JPEG fragment bundled inside the wiper binary, a low-resolution image of a partially burning American flag, written verbatim onto every infected drive. The fragments would have formed a low-resolution image of a burning American flag. The image was not the goal. The destruction was the goal. The image was the calling card. Within hours, every screen on the trading floor was dark. Every workstation in every wing of the campus was unbootable. The thousands of servers running internal applications, email, payroll, contracts, and shipment tracking were all offline. The corporate IP phone system, which depended on the same servers, went silent. The badge access system at the building entrances stopped recognizing employee cards. The cafeteria registers stopped accepting payments. Saudi Aramco, the company that supplies 1/10 of the world's oil, that funds the Saudi treasury, that employs tens of thousands of Saudi nationals, had been transformed over a single working day from the digital architecture of a global empire into 30,000 expensive paperweights. The chief executive officer was pulled out of a meeting. The chief information technology officer met him in the executive conference room. He had nothing reassuring to say. He said one word. The word that defines a category of malware nobody at Aramco had ever encountered before. Wiper. The bricked corporate network was a financial catastrophe. But Aramco's executives quickly realized the financial catastrophe was not the immediate threat. Saudi Aramco runs two completely different networks. The corporate network, the email, the payroll, the trading systems, the contracts, was the network that had been wiped. But the SCADA network, the supervisory control and data acquisition system, that physically operates 10,000 kilometers of pipelines, hundreds of pumping stations, and the complex distillation columns of every refinery, runs on a separate set of computers. The two networks are connected by a single guarded gateway. The gateway exists so that operations engineers can monitor SCADA telemetry from corporate offices, and so that scheduling systems can move oil between fields and refineries in coordination with shipment logistics. If Shamoon had already crossed that gateway, the consequences would not be financial, they would be physical, and they would be apocalyptic. A wiper executing on a SCADA controller does not just brick the controller. It can leave the controller in a state where the valves it commands are stuck open. The pumps it operates are running unmonitored. The pressure relief systems it manages are unresponsive. Pipelines could overpressurize and rupture. Refinery columns could overheat. The Saudi desert could become an environmental disaster zone overnight. The chief executive of the company did the only thing he could do. He gave the order to physically pull every cable connecting Aramco's corporate network to the rest of the world. Network engineers walked through every data center in Dhahran with bolt cutters. They yanked fiber-optic cables out of patch panels. They unscrewed transceivers. They severed the corporate network from the international internet, link by physical link. By the end of the afternoon, the most valuable company on Earth was completely disconnected from every external system. The SCADA pressure reading stayed normal. The bridge had been severed in time. The pipelines were intact. The physical infrastructure had been saved. But for months afterward, Saudi Aramco, the company that funds the Saudi treasury and supplies a tenth of the world's energy, ran its global business on fax machines, typewriters, and handwritten paper ledgers. Senior executives chartered private jets to hand-deliver multi-million-dollar contracts across the Middle East. The world's most digitally sophisticated energy company had been forcibly dragged back to 1973. The financial recovery from Shamoon required Saudi Aramco to do something no other company on earth could afford to do. They needed to replace the physical hard drives of approximately 30,000 workstations and several thousand servers immediately, simultaneously, in parallel. The Aramco Procurement Office, working from emergency conference rooms with no internal email, started making phone calls directly to hard drive manufacturing facilities in southern Taiwan, Thailand, and the Philippines. They placed an order for 50,000 drives. They paid premium pricing. They chartered wide-body cargo aircraft to fly the drives directly from factory loading docks to regional airfields outside Dhahran. The first pallets arrived on the desert runway less than a week after the wipe. The full procurement was completed inside 3 weeks. The collateral effect on the global market was immediate. The hard drive supply chain had been operating at steady-state inventory for every major retail and enterprise buyer on Earth. Aramco's emergency purchase consumed roughly an entire quarter of global production capacity in a single week. Consumer electronics retailers in the United States, in Europe, in East Asia found their shelves empty. Lead times for ordinary customers stretched from days to months. Personal computer manufacturers had to ration drive allocations to their assembly partners. The price of consumer hard drives spiked across multiple regions for the remainder of the third quarter. Inside Aramco, technicians worked around the clock for 2 months. They installed fresh drives in every machine. They re-imaged operating systems. They restored from off-site tape backups that, fortunately, had been air-gapped from the corporate network, and so had not been compromised by Shamoon. By early November 2012, Aramco's corporate trading floor was functional again. The full cost of the recovery was never publicly disclosed. Independent estimates have placed it in the high hundreds of millions of dollars in direct procurement, operational disruption, and contract penalties. But the real cost was the lesson the rest of the energy industry was forced to internalize. Shamoon was not the first wiper deployed against critical infrastructure. But Shamoon was the first wiper deployed against a target large enough and visible enough that the rest of the world was forced to learn the lesson the energy industry had been hoping nobody would notice. And Shamoon did not stop in 2012. In November 2016, a variant publicly designated Shamoon 2 surfaced inside the Saudi General Authority of Civil Aviation and several Saudi government ministries. The wiper logic was nearly identical to the 2012 original. The hard-coded detonation timestamp was set to a Friday evening when Saudi government IT staff were on the weekend. The result inside the Civil Aviation Authority was the same as Aramco 4 years earlier. Thousands of endpoints unbootable simultaneously, weeks of recovery, fax machines and typewriters back in service. In December 2018, an additional variant designated Shamoon 3 appeared. Inside Saipem, the Italian oilfield services contractor working with Saudi Aramco, primarily affecting servers across the Middle East, Scotland, and Italy. The malware family had become an enduring instrument of strategic pressure cyber operations, deployed selectively whenever a Gulf region target needed to be reminded that the silicon underneath the desk is brittle. The lesson is that the physical infrastructure that powers the modern world, the oil pipelines, the natural gas terminals, the electrical grids, the water treatment plants, The smart factories, the port logistics systems, the rail networks, the airport management consoles, does not run on steel. It runs on silicon. The steel is the visible architecture. The silicon is the invisible architecture that controls every valve, every pump, every gate, every load balancer, every fuel injector. And silicon is brittle. A single wiper, executing on a few thousand endpoints simultaneously, can transform any piece of modern industrial infrastructure into a paperweight in a single working day. The corporate network is the entry point. The SCADA network is the prize. The bridge between the two is the only thing protecting the physical world from the digital one. Shamoon was contained in 2012 only because Aramco's executives made the financially catastrophic decision to physically rip every cable connecting their corporate network to the internet. That option exists only for one company on Earth. For most modern infrastructure operators, severing the corporate to SCADA bridge means shutting down the entire facility. They cannot do it. They will not do it. They will hope the bridge holds. The doctrine of strategic pressure wiper deployment has, since 2012, been progressively absorbed by additional state-aligned threat groups. The North Korean attributed Lazarus Group deployed a wiper variant against Sony Pictures Entertainment in 2014. The Russian attributed Sandworm Group deployed NotPetya, examined in detail in File 11 of this archive, against Ukrainian and global infrastructure in 2017. Iranian attributed actors, including the cluster Western Threat Intelligence would later designate APT-33, have been linked to successor Shamoon-class variants, deployed against energy targets across multiple Gulf states throughout the late 2010s and into the 2020s. The pattern is consistent. The geopolitical adversary deploys a wiper. The adversary's identity is publicly attributed but never sanctioned at a level sufficient to deter the next deployment. The next deployment lands somewhere else, against someone else, 6 months later. The session is logged. The connection is closed. The files remain open. The corporate workstation in your office, the smart meter on your home, the engine management system in your car, the SCADA console in the water treatment plant down the street. Every one of those is one unguarded USB port, one negligent insider, one weaponized payload away from a 12-minute wipe. Which leaves us with the closing question of File 15. And the closing question of this season of Project Shadow Node. Which port in your life right now do you trust the least to not be the unmarked, unguarded, unmonitored entry point for the next Shamoon-class wiper that turns the silicon underneath your feet into 30,000 bricks at exactly 11:08 in the morning?